Beth. Yeah, this has been a journey, and it's just a good reminder and lesson and good networking and being friendly and treating people well. And I didn't know this book existed up until 2 years ago, so shame on Eric for not knowing that. I should have known, but I did it. And through friends and colleagues and lovers of history, I come to find that this book did, or I should say, the cover existed. I've always known about the book itself. I've read the book more times than I can count, but the covers were where we're at. And I was working with a friend, she came and asked a couple questions about this woman named Margaret Boyd. She's doing her dissertation, and the rules of hospitality. I said, yes, we have some stuff. We're happy to work with her. Her name's Allie LaForge, and she's a doctoral student at Brown University. And we had a wonderful conversation on the picnic bench because it was COVID, and we kept our distance and talked. And I shared a little with her, and then she shared in return and said, well, do you want to come give a talk out at Brown University? I said, yeah, that'd be lovely. I go, where is it? I didn't even know where Brown was. So I was learning a lot on this trip. And she's like, oh, it's here and here. And so I went out, and she's like, I'm going to introduce you to some of my friends who are in Massachusetts at a place called Amherst. I'm like, where's that? Man, you're pretty ignorant. I'm like, yeah, I know. So we went up to Amherst, and I met some individuals by name of Lisa and Mike and Sage and so on and so forth. And they said, hey, we have some native books, and we have a pretty spectacular item from your community. I'm like, really? And they brought it out, and I was pretty flabbergasted. And I said, we need to do more with this in the future. I'm like, well, what do we do? I'm like, bring it back. Okay. So me and Mike started, dreaming about bringing like 50 people in buses from Amherst. Mike ended up coming. So, but that's the important. The book came. That's the important part. So through continued conversation, they brought me out to Amherst to do some program. The kind of test run. This guy's not a wingnut. He kind of knows what he's talking about. And so the following summer, Mike is here, and he brought the book. And so the book is on display up front here, and we've been housing it for 2 days across the street at Anna J. Blackbird's house, where this is her brother. And just to have the book in the place was pretty significant, special, I think, for everybody who came through. And we had a descendant of the Blackbirds come through today, and they were just randomly coming through for their vacation. No. And they just were like, we're just stopping in because we do this all the time. And the guy was 87 from Green Bay. And he said he wanted to pull in but didn't know, and then turned back around and said, I think we should go in. Or the wife said, go in. And they came in, and we said, look at this. And the rest is just give me goosebumps. So to me, that's the highlight of the whole experience here. We had a guy from Paris come in, just kind of random. Like, this is a really lucky day. So this is a bit about the book. We're hoping to have more conversation with the book into the future, more collaboration. Amherst has over 3,000 native authored books in their collection, so we're hoping this will be a precedent for other communities to reach out and build these types of programs and relationships with where the materials come from. So we're hoping this is just the beginning. And we also we're big dreamers. So we're hoping, to have a modern Odawa artist create another quill box to put that book in, and then another box, and then another box. So at some point, 100 years from now, you have like these multiple boxes created by different artists from Waganakising. So we'll see, but we're starting with the book coming back to its original home here at Waganakising, and we want to do a little more education about not just Margaret. When I was asked to do this program, of course we're going to talk about Margaret, but you can't talk about Margaret without talking about the family. The family is hugely influential into the history of Waganakising Odawa. Any Odawa might not be here if it wasn't for Margaret and her family. So in putting this program together tonight, I just kept expanding the family tree. So this is more so about Margaret's family and their influence on this area. And of course, we're going to talk about Margaret, but I'm only going to talk about artwork for maybe a couple minutes. And so we'll get into the history of the family. So where we are is called Waganakising. And Waganakising has multiple translations: land of the crooked tree, it is bent, the homeland of the Odawa. And there's many beliefs about how long we've been here, but many of them go back to time immemorial, beginning. And this is from the American Philosophical Society. So I'm trying to pull a little different resources from different repositories. Great repository in Philadelphia. I've been there several times, and the first time I was pretty intimidated because this is where Ben Franklin started this thing. It's a big, pillars, middle of Philadelphia. It's like, am I welcome here? Do I belong here? And they opened the doors and said, yeah, we have a lot of materials from your community. And this is a sketch from Joe Shulman about 1915. And he just kind of sketched it on a loose piece of paper. And he goes, yep, there was a giant pine tree that once stood between what we call Cross Village and Middle Village. And this is the tree that is referred to as Waganakising. And the story I was told is that a very powerful spirit bent the tree at some point in time, making it Waganakising. And if you go into the Constitution of the Little Tribes of Big Band of Odawa Indians, we are a federally recognized tribe here in Emmett County, or Waganakising. And in the first couple sentences it says, we the Waganakising Odawa. So the reference, the identity is much with this, but also trees. And I've been all over the country, and I've had the good fortune to meet other Native people from Alaska to Hawaii, and they're like, what's your thing? I'm like, what do you mean, what's my thing? And they're like, what do you identify with? I'm like, my mom, my grandma. And I'm like, okay, but your landscape. I'm like, it's the water. Gitchigumek, but also trees. And in the area I'm from, on Matikamekw and Donjiba, I am from the place of the prayer tree. And that's referring to what we today call Cross Village. And that's what I grew up learning, knowing, but then learning the language on Matikamekw, place of the prayer tree does not refer to the giant cross that's in the village right now. It refers to that. So once I learned the word and the meaning, it took on a whole different meaning for me. This is what it is. The place of the prayer tree, not this giant crucifix on the bluff, but this. The tree's no longer there, and I usually have a couple people every year say, hey, Eric, I found the tree. No, you didn't. There are bent trees in the area. If you go over by Green Sky Hill, Old 31, Old Hart Bay Road, there are legitimate bent trees, but not this one. So you may see them in the woods or on the side of the road, and they're very significant, very special, but it's not the tree. The tree fell many years ago. It was a big pine tree. So this is where the story really starts, is home. This is the place that Odawa called home for thousands of years and continue to this very day. So home, the vision of it, the lens of it, may be seen through different eyes and how it's viewed. This is one of my favorites. I say this all the time, one of my favorites, but this is one of my favorites. And I believe it's at the Clements Library. It's at many different archives. And this is made by Moses Gibson, a local Odawa guy in the 1950s. And he probably forgot more than I'll ever know. And he names all the places in Odawa. So this has been a very valuable tool of just learning the original names for Waganakising. And in what we call Wikwidonsi, small bay place. And it's not referring to the resort place right now, but the original place that is where we are standing is called Wikwidonsi. And the story really takes place along this main road with Margaret and her family. We all have our places. My place is the village, or on Matikamekw. There's Bay Shore. There's Amikogemba, the Beaver Islands, which include High and Garden Island, Optawang, Middle Village, or Goodhart, Jingwaxibing, Pine River, also known as Charlevoix. I don't know how to say Bay Shore, but then there's some other smaller communities like 7 Mile Point, 5 Mile Point, that constitute Waganakising. So there's 9 bands that make up Waganakising, including the North Shore, which isn't on this map. That's from St. Ignace all the way to Escanaba. There's many Odawa villages, still Odawa living there today, especially Big Bay Danak. And then Burt Lake we also include as one of the 9 bands. So there's multiple groups of Odawa that make up the Waganakising. But Margaret and her family were primarily from here at Wikwidonsi, but we'll also get into where a couple of her uncles are from. And literally all of her uncles are chiefs. I don't know what's in the blood or the water for the family, but everybody in her family was a chief or a mover and shaker. But this is how the United States viewed this area in Margaret's time in the early 1820s. Very different, very rigid, very colonial. But I love it, like most of these older maps, whether it's a French map, a British map, or American map, and we have hundreds of these maps compiled at this point. Most of the time they have either, they call it l'arbre croche, which means bent tree in French, or little traverse. There'll be sometimes the only village listed in the entire state, because this was such an important center for politics, population, culture, art, all of it. So I love pulling all these old maps, and that'll be the only thing on some of these maps. L'arbre croche, little traverse. Or sometimes it says La Croix, which means the cross, which means the village. cross village, but it seems like they always have those. So it's very cool to like look at these really obscure, planning maps or military maps or whatever, and it has, Waganakising, but just different names. And in terms of branding, people see it all the time. Crooked Tree Breadworks, Crooked Tree Arts Center. There's a resort community called Lava Croche. There's a golf course, probably a couple of them called Lava Croche. So you see it, but this is the original meaning. So now we know we're talking about in this area, the family. So I've been reading and learning about this family for 20 plus years, and I always find something new, which I love. So her father, Margaret Blackbird, again, branding, they had a school named after the guy up on Wake Street. That was elementary school. That's where this is coming from. So Blackbird, he actually fought in the War of 1812. He's one of the warriors that actually took up arms against the Americans. And the Odawa from Waganakising fought against the Americans 3 times: the Revolutionary War, Little Turtles War, and the War of 1812. So that's our introduction to America, is that we were fighting to keep them out of Waganakising. Because we saw what was happening on the East Coast, it was coming west, and these warriors from the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, they were all creating these coalitions to keep this in check. But each subsequent war, it got more severe, more desperate. But Margaret did fight in the War of 1812. He fought over in Niagara. He fought at Mackinac. He probably was at Prairie du Chien. He was all over the place. And that is Margaret's father. And she would sign her letters, the daughter of an Odawa chief. And many refer to her as Princess Margaret. There's some truth to that. She could claim that. Because Margaret was, he put his life on the line, and he fought. But like many of the leaders back in the day, they weren't just one trick pony that could just go and fight. After the War of 1812 concluded in 1815, these guys knew immediately that we had to pivot in order to meet these challenges that were to come to this community, and they're coming immediately. And they pivoted through diplomacy, through action of government to government, and one of those actions is a treaty. So this is a whole other program unto itself that we could actually spend days on. Very complicated, but still impacts today all through the United States in every regard of Indian treaties. So after the war is concluded, Margaret and several other high-profile chiefs leave this actual bay at Zorn in October of 1835, and they paddle all the way to Washington, D.C. through November and most of December. And they do this because they have to do this, because Indian removal is happening all through east of Mississippi. And if they don't make the agreement in writing with the United States, we might be pushed out. And I might be giving this talk in Kansas, talking about the day it happened. But I'm giving the talk at Waganakising, talking about the day it didn't happen. And largely because of guys like Margaret Boyd. He was in the canoe, or canoes. There's multiple canoes that departed. So if you're here in November, go to the beach. If you got a kayak, go out in the water. And just think about the next 6 weeks. That's your life.
Wow.
And then, but they did this all, through Lake Huron, Ohio River Valley. Met with a guy named Andrew Jackson and Lewis Cass and Henry Schoolcraft, who were anti-Indian. They wanted everybody gone. So this is your audience. This is who you're working with. So, the stakes are at the highest level, and your adversaries were at the highest level as well. So Margaret Boyd, he was one of the treaty signatories, and that's Margaret's dad. So started with him. The mother, I haven't found the name. She obviously has a name, I just haven't found it in the records. But we do know that she died tragically in 1829 boiling sap. She sustained very heavy burns, boiling maple sap. So that's all I've seen in the records. I want to find her name. She obviously has a name, but at this point in time, we don't know, but we do know she had a pretty tragic ending. Her brothers, Andrew J. Blackbird, probably the most well-known guy in Harbor Springs. There's a museum across the street. That's his house. He was a postmaster, he was a surveyor, and he is an interpreter for the 1855 treaty, which was the final stamp of removing the threat of removal of the Odawa from this area. So he's an interpreter for that because in 1855, not many Odawa speak English. They're speaking Anishinaabe, their native language. So these interpreters were hugely important and very trusted. And was one of the interpreters for 1855. He was an advocate for education, citizenship, and he was an author. His book, The History of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians of Michigan, is a little book on the table up here. I think when my mentor, Jim McQuirkin, said, you got to read something, that was like the first book he gave me. And then he said, after that, there's about 90 other books you need to read. Like a good mentor does, but you go start with that one. And I still come back to it all the time. It's just really rich, has a lot of family history, but cultural history, political history. It's a good one. And he was also the postmaster. So it's really cool. You go across the street, you go into the house, and you see the desk for the postmaster. And the frame is still original and whatnot. So bringing the book back into the space at the house, that was just a moment. It was a moment to like have this come back. And again, that Blackbird family came to the house, and we're kind of joking, maybe not joking, like Margaret kind of brought you back. Because the guy said, well, we turned around and pulled back in. Yeah. I was like, yeah, that's cool. Margaret's brother, William, the other brother, William Blackbird, he studied at the Propaganda di Fide at the Vatican in Italy in the 1820s. This is pretty progressive stuff. And they did this because they knew that if you had a Catholic priest, especially ordained through the Vatican, this is a very, very powerful tool against removal. Mm-hmm. If you get our own ordained at the spot, the Vatican, that is going to push us against removal. So William and his cousin Augustine are over there studying in the 1820s to be Catholic priests, and William actually dies over at the Vatican under unknown circumstances. So his brother Andrew is convinced he's assassinated by jealous rivals, but he did have tuberculosis, but he was also only 23. So the mystery of William is out there. I've contacted the Vatican, and they contacted me back, which is kind of spooky. And they passed me around to the archives, the library, and the museum, and I think it was the library that just finally said we know about William, and that was it. I'm like, okay, so Vatican of you. Like, no further information. What he did down over there, supposedly there's a statue, he had papers, letters. So if anybody has any at the Vatican, let me know, and I can get into their archives. But William never made it back, but Augustine did. And he was the cousin to the Boyd and her family. Kanapima, he was looked at, or he was talked about. He was in those canoes when they departed the beach in 1835. And he was the head interpreter for that treaty. And he comes back, he's not ordained a priest, but he can speak Latin, French, English, and Anishinaabe more fluently. And he can read and write in Latin, French, and English. Pretty bright guy, he's like 23. And I love it because it's a game plan that's put in place by Makade Penase and others. They choose Margaret, William, and Augustine to study at a seminary school in Cincinnati in the late 1820s. So they start to see that we need to adapt quickly, in what better way than learning their language and how we communicate with reading and writing. So they sent these kids to the seminary school, and then from the seminary school, the priest invites William and Augustine to study at the Vatican, which they obviously accept. And Margaret studies for a few more years, and she comes back to Little Traverse Harbor Springs, and she's a school teacher for the next 30 years. So very progressive stuff is going on right here at Little Traverse very early. But the fact that these guys went across the ocean and studied for years, and then one of them never made it back, but one did. So without him, again, we might be talking in Kansas. So no offense to anybody from Kansas. They're uncles. So all of our uncles are movers and shakers. Every single one of them. A Siganak, a red-winged blackbird. He fights in the War of 1812. He's actually the head war chief for the Odawa during the war. And hundreds of guys would fight in the war, not just a dozen or two, hundreds. So when I look at the bay at Cross Village or Middle Village, I think of these armadas of war canoes departing. Smaller birch bark canoes, maybe 6-8 feet, 3-4 guys in each canoe, all departing from Waganakising, and they're going to fight in Niagara, like I said, Prairie du Chien, some at Mackinac, and the main dude is a Siganak. He is the main war chief, and that's Makade Penase's brother. He helped establish the Catholic Church in 1829 here. He's a very complicated guy, to say the least. So he fights in the war against the Americans. He's a devout Catholic his whole life. He helps establish the Catholic Church at Holy Childhood in 1829. So when you see all these like signs or any type of markings saying Harbor Springs 1829, that's him. That's where it comes from. And they start this because there's a schism between the traditionalists and the Catholics, and the traditionalists stay out in Cross Village, and then the Catholics come here to establish their own community. So that's how it kind of came down in the early 1800s. And him and his brother, Puxigun, started the church. But before, this is where it gets really complicated, Siganak leaves Waganakising in 1839 because he's so cagey about being removed to Kansas. And the government wanted us in Kansas. They told us in 1838, pack your bags, time to go. You know, it's time to leave. And we sent scouts to Kansas that came back and said, no. There's no trees and there's no water. And there's a bunch of really angry natives out there who keep having their rights and resources infringed upon. So we need to stay here. So Siganak goes the opposite way, and there was voluntary removal during the forced removal period. And a Siganak takes about 600 Odawa from this area and relocates to a place called Manitoulin Island and helps establish a community called Wacomico. Wiki, we call for short. And Wiki is a thriving community. I think there's like 8,000 people enrolled at Wacomico. And this is how things work sometimes. They kept their language pretty strong in Wiki. And a lot of fluent speakers are at Wiki, and they're coming back to Little Traverse and teaching classes on language. So it's all coming back full circle because they speak an Odawa dialect. So a lot of our language speakers are coming from Wiki and coming back to teach. So did a Siganak have that in mind? I don't know. Maybe. Puxigun, Smoky Mixture, he's a head chief of the Little Traverse at this time period. He's also one of the signatories of the 1836 Treaty of Washington, and with the Siganak's help, they helped create the church here. And then they have this anomaly in the family. Ninigun, the wing, he's actually pro-American during the war. He's down in Detroit. I don't know his story. But he's written in the Treaty of 1836 and as receiving some funds, and he's in the literature and the records as being a staunch advocate for Lewis Cass and so on. So I don't know what happened. There's always one in the family, I guess. But he is one of the brothers, and he lived mainly near Detroit. And then Wakazoo. There's, I don't know, more streets named after this guy in Michigan than Wakazoo. He's another brother of this family, and he's a chief, and he is the founder of modern-day Holland, Michigan. There's some Holland people in here. Wakazoo started that place, and Wakazoo is originally from somewhere between Cross Village and Middle Village, and Wakazoo is being pushed like every other native at this time period in the early 1800s to quit roaming, quit moving around. You have to stay in one spot like a quote-unquote civilized human. Okay, well, I didn't know chopping down all the trees and draining the swamps was civilized, but anyway, that's my snarkiness for the night. He goes, if I'm going to do this, then I'm going to go to my wintering grounds called Black Lake. And many Odawa would go south for the winter, and I don't say south as in Florida or Tennessee, like Chicago was the furthest, Grand Rapids. His place was Black Lake, we call Holland, and he was down there. He passes pretty quick. His sons take over leadership, and within about 10 years, they all had to relocate, and it's because of the Dutch coming in bringing smallpox. And they're bringing it, and it's decimating the community. And his son Peter Wakazoo makes the call in 1849, June, that we have to leave immediately or we're all going to die. So they pack up their boats and canoes, and they paddle back home in June of 1849, and the Reverend Smith, who's administering to his flock at the time, it's all in his diary, it's this book called Old Wing Mission, and he's talking about the day the Indians leave, and before they leave, they go to the cemetery and unearth all their ancestors and wrap them in blankets and put them in the canoes and bring them back and rebury them at the Leelanau Peninsula. I've never read or saw this in such they went to everybody. They didn't just take one or two people, they went to the entire cemetery and brought all their people home. And that's one of my favorite stories. We have a very strong connection with our ancestors to this very day through ghost suppers. which we still do in the community, but they just took it to another level and said we don't leave anybody behind. We're bringing them all, and they did, and they're buried at the Leelanau. So I got to get some GTB people. Like, I know the cemetery's there, but it's off the grid. So if I can find somebody from GTB, I just want to pay my respects. But all of this is Margaret's family. It's just amazing, all the uncles. We're doing all these things, just shaping not just Odawa history, but Michigan history and U.S. and international history of before 1812. So big family of influence. That's a Siganak. It's a Paul Kane painting. And this is while he was over at Manitoulin. And very simple. A lot of guys at the time, the war paint was very elaborate. This is just some stripes on his face. The septum piercing denotes leadership, that he is a chief. It wasn't fashion. And the cross, or could be a cross on his forehead, could be a four-direction symbol, but he was Catholic. But most of his warriors were quote-unquote pagans. They weren't Catholic. So I think at that point, you're going to fight. But that is a Siganak. There's a great book by Cecil King called, it's Walking in Two Worlds, I believe, but it's the biography of Siganak. So the siblings, I already talked about. That is Augustine Hamlin. And this is right when he got back from Rome. That's why he looks so European. Very dapper. Young guy. He's coming back from Rome, and he actually stops in Philadelphia. And he stopped at the American Philosophical Society. And he has one page that they still have, the original notes of some language, numbers, in his handwriting. So that was pretty cool to see. And very complicated guy as well. Lewis Cass hated him as well, but Henry Schoolcraft really hated him because he was better than Henry Schoolcraft. Smarter, more driven, and every time Henry Schoolcraft tried to craft some language to remove us, he would counter it. And that's not what that word means. And there's a very specific word in the Treaty of 1836 in Article 2 that says the Odawa and Ojibwe may be removed after 5 years. And he knew what may meant, it wasn't must. And Schoolcraft was framing it as, you must go in 5 years. 5 years provision is up, you must go. He's like, no, it's may. That means that there's some wiggle room in this, and it's at the discretion of the president, and the president hasn't said anything at this point, so we're going to stay here. So, very influential figure, but he dies at age 48 from tuberculosis. So, very short life, but very bright, and I believe he's buried at St. Anne's in Mackinac Island. So I believe that's where he's at. It says that the highest point in Mackinac Island, so that's St. Anne's. That's Margaret's cousin. So we get to Margaret. I don't even want to try to pronounce her name, but it's Woman of All Day. And she's born in 1817, just right here in Little Traverse. I don't know exactly where. 1817, this is all wigwams. There might be a few cabins, maybe, but Main Street here is all wigwams, all Odawa. There's not even a resident priest at this time, a visiting priest. It's 100% Odawa. And she passes in 1892. So her life spans the entire 19th century. It's quite amazing what she saw in her lifetime. We'll get to that. And she attended the seminary school down in Cincinnati, roughly from 32 to 35. She returns home, and she's a teacher. She's one of the first female native teachers in the state at this point. So she's teaching youth how to read, how to write. But as we're going to see, she's also a very prominent artist with quill work and birch bark. So without a doubt, she's teaching these people how to harvest properly, ethically harvesting without killing the trees, how to go with sweetgrass, so on and so forth. So she's passing on cultural knowledge, I'm sure, just as much as Western. So there's a lot of different types of educations. I'm not just saying she was solely focused on Western education. She had a lot of traditional and cultural knowledge that she was passing on as well, because we still have quill working in the community. There's still quill workers. That has been passed on from generation to generation from people like Margaret. But she is an advocate for all education, treaty rights, and especially land, which we're going to see here in a little bit. She was a fierce woman for land and land rights for the Odawa. And she was known as Princess Margaret. Everybody knew her. People would get off the boats, they'd go right down the street, and they would pay their respects to the princess and have conversations. And you went and saw Margaret. You weren't going through town without seeing her. But her dad was Waganakising as well. So she had that lineage. So this is woman of all day. And that's one of the postcards later in life. I don't know who the child is. I'm assuming one of her nephews or cousins, I don't know. But I love it that she has a war club.
Yeah.
A lot of her photos, she has a war club. And there's a lot of messaging going on in this photo with that. And I believe that might be her father's war club. I'm assuming it is. And that war club probably took some American lives because he fought in the War of 1812 and made it back home. So there's a lot of power in that club, but the message that we are fighters. You know, we're fighting for our rights, our land. And she has a traditional Odawa headdress, and you don't see very many women wear those. It's usually the guys, but she is a leader in the community. She has the right, and it's not the big giant plains headdress like you see with Chief Joseph or Sitting Bull. Or that's their style. This is Odawa style, and I think she was only like 5 foot. She wasn't the top. She wasn't the biggest human in the world. That's for sure. And that dress, that's her dress. So that's not that exact dress, but one of the dresses that she wore. And so this is a postcard, and postcards are very complicated. I always have to preface that everything native is complicated.
I'm 4'10".
There it is. Perfect. And these postcards are being produced in mass, throughout the country, especially northern Michigan. The idea for many taking the photos for the postcards is we were the vanishing race, and then we will just all simply disappear. So we better get a picture of them before they're all gone. And that would be for the next 30, 40 years. And so people come up from Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, all the big urban centers, and just get pictures of natives, because northern Michigan had one of the largest native centers in the Midwest, especially between Harbor Springs and Cross Village. So people just come up to take pictures of natives. So we see a lot of these stage photos for postcards, but that is Margaret. And then this is probably, again, my favorite, I always say this, one of my favorite photos of Margaret here in Harbor Springs. And you can see the quill work for the basket in front of her. And I believe that's at the Grand Rapids Public Museum. So Grand Rapids has some stuff. And just a shameless plug that the Grand Rapids Public Museum is totally revamping their Anishinaabe exhibit. And within the next 3 to 5 years, it'll be completely revisioned. So go back in a couple years and check it out. So the basket is made out of birch bark with porcupine quills, and very ornate scene. Lots of Catholicism going on here, without a doubt. But if you look real closely on her table, right by her elbow, she has 2 pipes, 2 ceremonial pipes. So I love it that she kind of sneaks that in. Like, yeah, there's got all this going on, Virgin Mary, Jesus, crosses. When you look really close, the pipes are very sacred for the Odawa, especially if they're made out of pipestone, or catlinite we call it. So she has 2 of them. So I don't know how old, she's older in this photo obviously, but the fact that there's this blending, and that would be something very common for Odawa people up until the present day, of being very flexible, because they had to be. And many Native people at this time period in Margaret's life, they didn't have a lot of the options to practice their traditions openly. Native religion would be outlawed technically until 1978. We'd have a law called the Indian Religious Freedom Act to openly practice our beliefs. So this was a time when it wasn't too friendly to practice out and open. So maybe that's why I think she kind of put this with everything else. But I love it that it's out there in plain sight but hiding. So Margaret, we love you for that. So she has a very well-known journey to Washington, D.C. 1877. This originates here, right in Harbor Springs. And it's a restaurant now, it's called Depot, but that's the original train depot. So that's where Margaret gets on the train. She wasn't ordering dinner or anything, she was getting on the train. And she's getting on the train in advanced years, and she's going because Odawa lands are being taken through fraudulent claims in the 1870s. So we're losing all of our land here, primarily at Little Traverse, between Little Traverse and Cross Village. So that's a very complicated story for a whole nother program. But Odawa people were losing their lands through multiple means, and she had enough of it, and she was like, I'm gonna go talk to the president myself. I'm gonna go right to the top, because that's what her husband, or her father did, her uncles. They didn't go through Indian agents and so on and so forth, they went right to the top, and that's what she did. So she got on this train, and it was during the summer, and she sold Odawa art that she made to fund her trip. Baskets, quill work, like the story I was told and read that she had like a trunk, and she had all this artwork, and she would just sell it at these different stops, because from between here and DC, that's not a small trip. In 1877, you're making multiple stops, and she sold artwork to get there and back. And her visit actually prompted an investigation into illegal actions on the Little Traverse Reservation. So she went there, she met with the president, and there are two very, very different responses to her trip we'll get into. But she fought for Odawa lands basically until she passed in 1892. So when I see her with the War Club, that's what's going on. So what are these responses to this monumental trip that Margaret made out to DC? Well, one is from, of course, the newspapers. Mind you, this is the late 19th century, so the wording's gonna be a little different. They're gonna say some things we don't say today. But Mrs. Margaret Boyd of this village has returned from the city of Washington after a talk with the Great Father, which is often referred to President Grant, who received her with good cordiality and listened to her complaints concerning her people in this section of the country. And after entertaining her for more than an hour with deep attention, he assured her that he would do what he could do right the wrongs done to Indians in the part of the state. She was taken to the interior of the Indian Department and introduced to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who heard her petitions and grievances with marked attention. And at the close of her statement, he guaranteed her and her people redress. So that's one version of this very long, difficult trip. She was thrown off trains, she was harassed. It wasn't an easy trip for her. And this is her response. This is actually at the National Archives. So I don't have like a secret vault in my office. This is, you can go look at this at any time. And that's the National Archives under RG, Record Group 75, the Mackinac Agency up there. I gave you the citation, so make it a lot easier for you. And Margaret has about, I don't know, a couple dozen letters at the National Archives. So this is nothing secret, but that's her actual handwriting. And she had really good handwriting for the time too. It was really remarkable. I mean, I've seen some of the priest writing and Indian agents. It's basically illegible. But Margaret took her time. It's very beautiful. And thank you, because I have to transcribe this stuff. And so when you can't transcribe something, you can't read it. So this is the actual letter. I wanted to show you the actual letters, so you know I'm not just making this up. And that's the transcription.
Would you please read it for the people in the back row?
Yep, this wet my whistle. A poor child went a great long way to see her great father. To the poor children returning home with greater grievance, no satisfaction answer from the great father to his poor child. I went there to ask you to give these new families who never had any lands from the great father, who ought have had the lands. That was my intention of undertaking that long, bitter journey, many times most throwing me out of the cars because I had not money enough to pay full fare. And after all, not obtaining anything, we do not want to take lands, as homesteads, because we are obliged to cut down trees and clear the land, but we want to preserve our trees from cutting down to make sugar, for we use a great deal of sugar. This is the object of your poor children by sending me to see their great father. Personally, to hear him from his own word, and when they saw me coming home, they all rushed in haste to the house, asking what the great father had said. Almost ashamed to tell them that the man who had taken me to see the great father did not give me no time to hear any answer or obtain even a spool of thread from the father of poor children. Oh, great father, who is full of power to do anything but create another world, Do please have compassion and pity your children, for we are your poor Indian children. For as we've been always coming home such bitter long journey for a poor old woman of 60 years like me, please excuse and pardon me, a poor child who went so far to see her great father, to talk to him personally as a child to his own father. Your poor child, Margaret, I'll try it. Ogajabigokwe. Then after it says, please excuse my poor writing. I was told by some of those men in the office that the great father did not wish to see his children. Poor me, going so far a journey to see the father. I do not see why a father does not wish to see his poor child, coming to him from so long way, and not let him see him only half a minute. Oh, tears, tears all the way home, and the same time of me going so far, trying to sell our land, trying to sell our Indian work to get money to pay our fares. These whites here who are with us, they tax us so high, so that we cannot, no way, get money paid for tax, and therefore buy our lands for tax. This is why they do it, to take our lands away from us poor Indians. So, great Father of all, send someone here to stay with us, right here to protect and defend us poor Indians. We always thought our forefathers told us that the Great Spirit created us and gave us this part of the world to be our living lands. This is your poor child, would tell you, but no time giving to her to talk to her father. So she wrote this at her house down the road. And this is probably top 5 letters for me. I mean, a lot of heart, a lot of emotion. And she's got a lot of layers to this. But I really want to draw on the last line of living lands. She doesn't see this as natural resources or, this is something that's alive for us. And at the time, she talks about making sugar, and the trees are so important. And at the time, you're supposed to homestead it and clear it. But they didn't want to do this because of what it produced in living lands. So they wouldn't cut the trees down, and people said, oh, it's abandoned. It's not cleared, it's abandoned, and people are just going to take it. So this was happening all through this area, and she fought back. Again, the war club. She was using her intelligence, all of her means to fight for Odawa lands right in this area. So this is one of a couple dozen letters that she wrote. And this is an actual canoe made by Margaret. It's at the Grand Rapids Public Museum. It's about 3 feet long, it's larger. And so if you're ever at Grand Rapids, please, when the museum's up and running, it's all being reconstructed at this point. But that's just an example of Margaret's own work herself. And these canoes are very popular, along with other quill boxes and book covers and coasters and glove boxes. They were making this en masse. And another shameless plug, if you're ever in Vienna, Austria, go to the Welt Museum Wien. It's one of their national museums, equivalent to our Smithsonian. Go to the North American cultures, and you're going to see Waganakising artwork from the 1800s, but also from the modern day. So I'll just leave it at that. But our work is all over the place. It's pretty good. So another letter that Margaret wrote much later in 1881. This is about 10 years before her passing. And it's received by the Michigan Superintendency and Mackinac Agency. Again, this is NARA. This is the National Archives in DC. So again, no secret vault in Eric's office that I just bring out once in a while. Everybody can go see this stuff. I fear much to lose my land, my 80 acres of land that the government gave us to live on. As I told you before, that the lawyers had mortgaged it for $400 to pay scoundrel men who had arrested my poor old husband 3 years ago. He pretended he was hooked by a little bull of 2 years old, and this villain who stolen himself from Canada by night and came to this place. And he claimed the little bull belonged to my old man. And we did not own no kind of bull at all. But the whites always lied against the poor ignorant Indians. We know not of law, and we fear much to swear lies in the name of God as they do. Although we swear the truth that the lawyers will not believe us. Then the judge decided judgment against us to pay this villain just for nothing, only perfect fraud. And man not guilty of anything, nor owing a penny to anybody. This is the way of the poor Indians, us losing our land. This is the reason why I'm so downhearted for my land. Because we live by land, and we have already lost many lots in town just for this lie made to us. And sometime next summer, this 80 acres is to be sold at auction, and I suppose we will lose it for good this time. It was once sold for tax sales. We never missed paying our taxes 1 year. I only wish I could see the commissioner personally, as I could explain to him how they are doing on us. They published many lies against the Indians. So Margaret was continually fighting for lands all through her life and never gave up. And later in life, she went and actually testified to these grievances in court. And there was a couple different narratives that were being pushed out by newspapers in the non-native communities that Margaret had misinterpreted, that she was lying herself. And so she had to do this response to everybody at this time. And this is 1 year before she passed away in 1891. I said, no, I'm going to set the record straight, that I did not misinterpret, I did not lie. I shall declare to the end of my life that we Indians never testified to such a lie. Our meaning has been misunderstood. I explained it plainly, and all the Indian witnesses explained the same thing, that we were dissatisfied and displeased because Alexander Nissaquat had sold the Harbor Point to Father Wycamp for a church and school when the Indian of the trust who owned it objected to the sale. I also explained plainly that the reason we did not like the lots we got from the administrators so well as those we got from Nissaquat was because those lots were not so good. We all knew the administrators could not give us any more of the best lots because Nissaquat had already distributed those amongst us, but nobody ever said that they were dissatisfied with the work done by the administrators. We are only poor Indians who are now almost crushed out. We do not hope for justice in this world, but we nevertheless cling to our old love for the truth, and you cannot find one among us, except some of the young boys who have been degraded by whiskey and bad white men, who would testify to such a lie as we are accused of. So this is one of her last letters before she passed. And again, this was written right down the road. I believe she lived behind the church. And then we have one of many obituaries. He was such a well-known figure that multiple newspapers published the obituary when Margaret passed. And January 13th, 1892, death of Aunt Margaret Boyd. About midnight on Tuesday night of last week, Aunt Margaret died at her home in Harbor Springs, aged 75 years. Her Indian name was Ogabi-Jokwe, woman of all day, and she was the daughter of the Ottawa chief Mukade Penase. She was born in Little Traverse, now Harbor Springs, and in her girlhood attended a Covenant school in Cincinnati. She returned to Little Traverse and was married at the age of 20, and therefore, for many years, teacher of the government Indian school at that point. Aunt Margaret was a devout Catholic and had always backed up the Franciscan brothers in their work among the Indians with great influence. According to her life, she was a good woman and was exceedingly shrewd in the way of business. The white man or woman who ever got away with Aunt Margaret in a deal is hard to find. For a number of years past, the fashionable visitors to the resorts around the bay had taken great interest in the princess, and her humble house in Harbor Springs was visited by very many people every summer. It is said that she leaves quite a comfortable estate behind her. So everybody knew her, and she was her own businesswoman. She wasn't a pauper, and that she had a lot of pull within the community. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly where her house was. That's one of my goals, is like what lot, where was Margaret's house? But what she saw in her lifetime is utterly remarkable. She sees as a young child the post-war of 1812 era, that only Odawa are living in Waganakising. Then she witnesses Indian removal, that many people are being removed, and especially down by Battle Creek, Kalamazoo, that a lot of Potawatomi people, many Odawa are related to, are being forced out to Kansas, and many are still there. She sees the Treaty of 1836 negotiated by her uncles to avoid removal. And then in 1838, between 1838 and 1840, hundreds of her people leave from Manitoulin Island. Some do return, but many stay and create Wacomiacon. And then during the same time period of 38 to 40, we have massive crop failures and there's smallpox outbreaks throughout Michigan. And these are devastating all people, especially Native people. It's rampant, it's devastating to not just us, but the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi. The smallpox has taken out entire villages. And on top of this, we have to negotiate another treaty in 1855 to keep us here permanently. So between 36 and 55, there's a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. Is the government going to remove you? Do we have to go to Canada? And so the leaders make another treaty that's negotiated in Detroit, the Detroit Treaty of 1855, that keeps the Odawa here permanently. So without those two treaties, again, Kansas. Then the thing called the Civil War breaks out. And Margaret is alive during this period. And then in 1871, we have the newspaper article. I couldn't dig it up right away. But in 1871, that's the exact year the Odawas become minorities at Waganakising. It's in the newspapers that there's this mini land rush in Charlevoix and Emmett County, and that the Indians will now not be the majority. So we know exactly when the shift happened. It was in 1871. And then right at the tail end of Margaret's life, the Holy Child of Jesus Indian Boarding School opens in 1886. So you can't, I don't think, see any more change in a person's life than this woman. And she never left Harvard. Well, she did as a kid, went to Cincinnati, came back, but she always stayed here. She did her trips, obviously, but she's never ever left permanently Harvard. Which we don't see, Little Bay Place. So that's a little bit about her. It was a real honor and pleasure to do the deeper dive into Margaret for this program tonight. I always knew about her and the story and the journey, but to do a little bit more digging, find these other letters that she had written, I didn't know they existed. So definitely we'll keep this ongoing piece of research into the future, because we want to bring the book back and follow up and have another program down the road. Maybe they have another thing that's Odawa over in Amherst. I don't know. Mike, help me out. And we can keep building on this. Or, like I said, I'm just throwing it out there, maybe we'll have the box constructed, the modern quill box, to put into, put the book into. So that would be kind of cool. We create another storage unit for Margaret's book that's made by Odawa, with quill work and birch bark and so on and so forth. So I'm just putting it out in the universe so it can happen. So with that, I want to say miigwech. That's roughly thank you in our language. But it's everything. There's multiple translations, and I want to honor one of the translations I was given by one of my elders from a place called Mille Lacs, Minnesota. His name is Skip Churchill. Learned a lot from him. He recently walked on, and we were out at the ceremonies. Beautiful day, like today, talking, catching up, and he was reminiscing about being in this space and how important space and where you are is. And he's like, I've never been where you are really, and he goes, but I'm glad you're out here with me and talking and learning. And he was talking about being a kid in the 60s, and that the Indian agents would come to the res and break up the ceremony. And this is a person with living memory of religious persecution in this country. And he goes, you're a historian. I'm like, I'm trying to be, Skip. And he goes, what's that thing that happened in the 70s? I go, the Indian Religious Freedom Act? He goes, yeah, that. We can come back out. And everybody started to come back out and re-engage, but so many people walked on or just weren't engaging. But he talks about, coming back and bringing it back. And so I think about that a lot with Margaret. She was bringing it back. That she was in this space. She was bringing this knowledge, this fight, and, fighting for land, living land that really sticks out the most. This living land of our home. And Skip was dropping knowledge, and then he's like, well, let's end it now, we gotta get going, but I want to say miigwech. And he goes, do you know what that means, Eric? I'm like, oh, here comes the teaching. I go, what? Thank you. He goes, yeah, that's one. I go, okay, what's the Skip version? He goes, well, what I was taught, and that's the master preface for everything, what I was taught. Because I'm only sharing tonight what I was taught. I don't represent the entire tribe. I don't represent the Odawa. I represent Eric, who was raised by an Odawa family from Cross Village. My mom was on the tribal council in the 80s. I grew up in a native home, an Odawa home. That's me, an Anishinaabe home. Skip was telling about his Anishinaabe way. He's like, miigwech means all that you have given me. I'm grateful. I like that. He goes, you've given me your time, your energy, your space. You came out here, you drove 10 hours. That's what's, where we're coming at. I'm like, I like that, Skip. He's like, yep, that's enough for today, you don't get any more. Time to go, time to get to work, you gotta go haul basswood and cedar and all these other things, so, let's get to it. So with that, I wanna say miigwech for everybody coming out and for the museum hosting, and, you know, miigwech has big thanks to Amherst for, you know, bringing this piece of our story back to its home. And I think this is just another step in this building of relationship and storytelling. So with that, miigwech.